On the Sunday after the declaration of the State of Israel, I, together with 20,000 other Jews in Chicago, gathered at the Chicago Stadium for a program to commemorate this historic event. The program began by the raising of the Israeli flag to the rafters of the stadium. When that happened, a sea of tears engulfed everyone who was present. The whole 2,000 years of exile poured out of us. The Holocaust, everything was loosed. And 20,000 Jews, and there were another 20,000 Jews in the parking lot who couldn't get in, were united perhaps as no other time in their lifetime. Towards the century's midpoint, the world, and especially the Jewish world, had been radically transformed. Eastern European Jewry had all but vanished. And hundreds of thousands of Jews were incarcerated in Stalin's Gulag, while millions more were trapped behind the Iron Curtain. The majority of the world's Jews now resided in the United States. Over 850,000 were living in peril in Arab lands. 650,000 Jews lived in the new state of Israel, where in 1948 the war for Israel's survival was now intensifying.
Army units from a half a dozen Arab countries were now advancing into Israel. The Egyptian army reached the outskirts of Jerusalem and within 16 miles of Tel Aviv. Some of the fiercest and bloodiest battles of the War of Independence were fought to break the Arab siege on Jerusalem. Wave after wave of Haganah and Palmach fighters trying to free Jerusalem were driven back. Many were killed. To circumvent the problem, the Haganah and civilian workers, led by Mickey Marcus, an American World War II Army colonel, heroically improvised a 16-mile relief road through the Judean hills, known as the Burma Road. Eventually, the Jewish forces broke through the Arab blockade, and with the loss of over 1,000 lives, freed western Jerusalem. However, they were unable to dislodge the Jordanians from their stranglehold on the old city's Jewish quarter. With their food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies cut off, and under increasing Arab attacks, the situation for the 1,700 Jewish residents of the old city and their 150 armed fighters was desperate. When the Jordanians blew up the ancient Chova synagogue, the beleaguered residents were unable to hold out. And on May 28, 1948, they surrendered. Of the 150 defenders of the old city, only 43 survived.
The War of Independence was Israel's most difficult war. It lasted almost a year, which makes it also the longest war. And the most significant fact about it was that 6,000 Jews, approximately 1% of the Jewish population in the country at that time, perished in the war. The first month was the most crucial month. Israel still did not have neither the organization nor the weapons needed for this kind of war.
When Israel declared its independence in May 1948, the army did not have a single cannon or tank. The air defense was composed of only 11 outdated light planes. The few weapons they did have were smuggled from abroad. Volunteers from all over the Jewish world, as well as many Jewish veterans from World War II, came to Israel to help defend the fledgling state. Survivors from the DP camps in Europe also joined the army as soon as they arrived.
The Jewish army fought heroically with limited means. After 4 weeks of fighting, both sides agreed to a ceasefire. The irony was that the Israeli army apparently was on the brink of collapse. The Arabs did not know that. Perhaps if they had just persevered at that point, who knows what would have happened. The ceasefire gave Israel time to import arms and manpower, and thus the tide of the war was changed.
At that time, the United Nations embargo prevented Israel from legally importing arms. However, this embargo did not apply to the independent Arab countries that were attacking the new Jewish state.
The Zionists needed some systematic supply of arms. The Soviet Union accommodated them and used its soon-to-be client states, Czechoslovakia and Poland, as conduits for arms, ammunition, and even training of the Zionist forces. And thus the Soviet Union actually played a major role in the creation of the State of Israel.
The Amusement Division of the Federation of Jewish Philanthropies gathers at Hotel Sheraton Astor in New York City for the 3rd annual presentation of Achievement Awards. Industry leaders...
This is a time of tremendous activity, tremendous vitality in terms of the establishment of the State of Israel. American Jews should not only get involved in terms of their hearts and minds and pocketbooks, but varying Zionist groups who are involved in legal and illegal smuggling of arms to the State of Israel.
The main fighting force of the Israeli army consisted of the 2 groups of former underground fighters. The government fighting forces, the Haganah, with its elite strike force, the Palmach, under Ben-Gurion, and the Irgun Etzel resistance group under Menachem Begin. However, the tension that had existed between them prior to 1948 finally came to a head when Etzel attempted to bring a ship into Tel Aviv harbor loaded with desperately needed arms. The ship was called the Altalena.
The ship was brought in to Israeli shores in defiance of the embargo, but also in defiance of the civilian government. There was a suspicion that this can lead to a putsch by the Etzel against the government.
This ship brings to the new state of Israel its most tragic hour. Beached off Tel Aviv during the night, it is manned by troops of the Irgun, irregular and dissenting faction of the Jewish fighting forces, who are determined to land a huge cargo of ammunition. As the Irgunists hit the beach, open battle breaks out. The waterfront becomes a no man's land. Brother fights brother up and down the beach. A shore mortar blasts the vessel, setting it afire. Fire reaches into the ship's hold, exploding tons of ammunition, grenades, and aerial bombs, and driving its occupants overboard. The ship is doomed.
A civil war was averted when Menachem Begin, who was on the ship at the time, gave orders to his men to hold their fire.
The bloody clash ended with casualties on both sides, but mostly on the ship.
After this, the separate fighting forces were disbanded, and Ben-Gurion created a united Israel Defense Force, a single Jewish force under the direct control of the Minister of Defense, Ben-Gurion himself.
The During the summer of 48, Israel went on the offensive, both in the Galilee and in the Negev, as well as in the center of the country. And actually, the number of soldiers that it put in the field was eventually greater than the numbers of the attackers.
In early August, the Israeli forces captured the main airport near Tel Aviv. At this point, the Arab forces were in disarray and in conflict with each other. King Abdullah of Jordan annexed much of Arab Palestine, as well as the old city of Jerusalem, incurring the wrath of the Egyptians, who had taken over the Gaza Strip and had their own ambitions to rule Palestine.
The combined force of that, if it were better organized, better trained, better led, because they didn't have any unified leadership. They had unified command, but everybody did practically what they wanted. They didn't even have a unified plan. You go to a military expedition, you have to have a purpose, a goal, a plan. Nothing of that works, and that's the reason why Israel defeated them piecemeal.
In the final phase of the war, Israel surrounded the Egyptian army and took control of the Negev, which had been allotted to the Jewish state by the United Nations. Dramatic battles raged into Egyptian territory in the Sinai Desert. Britain, in support of their own self-interests in the Arab world, intervened and threatened armed cooperation with Egypt to force Israel to withdraw from the Sinai. Under this pressure, Ben-Gurion agreed. The battered and demoralized Egyptian army retreated from the Negev, returning in defeat to Egypt, and with that, the War of Independence was over, and Israel was the surprise victor. As a result of the war and the flight of the Arab population, Israel gained control of more land and borders that were hard to defend. In March 1949, Israel was admitted to the United Nations and signed armistice agreements with Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria.
We had what we called the armistice borders, which were very temporary. It is the Arabs didn't want to see in them permanent borders because they say, well, okay, this time we will not win. There will be a second and then a third round, and they will certainly overwhelm you because Israel has no vitality. It doesn't have what it takes for a state to survive. And for now, after 60 years, they fortunately turned out to have been wrong.
The Arab war to destroy Israel had failed. But let us not forget who started this war. Israel never wanted war, and then as now, Israel wanted peace with its Arab neighbors. Because of their aggression, the Arabs would end up with less territory than they would originally have had if they had only accepted the United Nations partition plan. If the United Nations or the West had enforced the partition plan, perhaps many lives on both sides might have been saved.
5 days after the War of Independence, Israel's Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion said, "The enemy forces in the neighboring Arab countries and in the world at large have not yet despaired of their scheme to annihilate Israel. As long as we cannot be confident that we have won the last battle, let us not glory." In the aftermath of the 1948 war, refugee camps for Arabs who had fled Palestine were set up in Lebanon, the West Bank, Jordan, and the Gaza Strip. The surrounding Arab nations refused to assimilate their fellow Palestinian Arabs into their societies. With Russian support, they also pushed through a resolution at the United Nations giving these refugees a right of return to their former homes. Israel rejected the resolution and considered it non-binding, since it was never passed by the United Nations Security Council.
There is a whole gamut of claims and counterclaims about what happened to the Arabs who became refugees for 4 generations now. And the truth of the matter is that there is a mix of all those things. I think the big majority of them, like in any human situation of this sort, when there is a crossfire and people are caught in, the first thing that they want is safety for their families, their children. So they run out of the battlefront. And this is what happened to most of them. They ran away either to Gaza, south, or north to Beirut. And that's where the big refugee camps are still until today.
During the fighting, people were driven out. And eventually, it became also a strategic consideration. You cannot leave a large hostile population behind your back.
But that's not the majority. That's a minority. There were others who were simply tempted by Arab speeches, mainly the Khawqji in the north, Haj Amin Husseini, the leader of the Palestinians, or by other Arab leaders. We are coming to rescue you. It will take 2 or 3 weeks, and we'll come back as victors. So rather than suffering there, come temporarily. We'll give you shelter, and then you'll come with us as victors.
The human tragedy of what happened after the Arab-Israeli War is that unlike Europe after World War II, when Greeks took in the ethnic Greeks, Poles took in the ethnic Poles, Germans took in the ethnic Germans, the Arab world refused to take in the Palestinian refugees who were their brothers in religion, language, and social behavior. Unfortunately, these refugees were purposely left to languish and squalor in the refugee camps.
The fact is that 150,000 Arabs remained in Israel, and they have now thrived and became 1.5 million, about 20% of the population in Israel. That means the idea, the legend, the story about ethnic cleansing that was done is simply not true.
The Arab refugee camps received United Nations aid for the entire second half of the century. They have become havens for terrorists operating against Israel. Both the United Nations and the Arab world unrelentingly have used the refugee issue as a political and diplomatic weapon against Israel, while deflecting the real issues that underlie the Arab-Israeli conflict to this day.
When we fought and we won the War of Independence back in 1948, we thought that now that we are fighting for peace. The Arabs and Muslims in general are not fighting for peace. They are fighting for our elimination. So we don't fight for peace, we fight for survival. And they fight for our elimination.
The basic question that underlies the Arab-Israeli conflict is why the Arabs have been so unrelenting and uncompromising towards the very existence of the State of Israel itself.
The War of Independence was, from the point of view of the Arabs, they call it the Nakba, the catastrophe, because it was a war, a victory that they simply could not accept either theologically or politically or existentially.
To have a basic understanding of the problems that exist between the Arabs and the Jews, we have to go back nearly 14 centuries to the year 622 and the Prophet Muhammad himself. Muhammad comes to Medina with his book of Revelation and his mission to bring his teachings of Islam to Christian and Jewish believers as well as to pagans. The Jews who had lived there for many centuries and who had trusted in their Torah as being the eternal word of God rejected Muhammad's teachings. They believed the era of prophecy had passed, and that Muhammad's revelations were not the culmination of God's word for all mankind, as Muhammad himself believed. The reaction of Muhammad to their rejection set the precedent for the ongoing conflict between the Muslims, Jews, and Christians till this very day.
The first of the large Jewish tribes was ousted from Medina. The second was invited to become a subjugated, tribute-bearing people to the Muslims. The third of the Jewish tribes had all the males beheaded and the women enslaved. The diatribe between Muhammad and the Jews, the vitriolic exchanges, are part of what are considered today to be the Holy Writ embodied in the Quran. The Quran in several places is quite specific in its condemnation or directives about the place of the Jew or the Christian. For instance, in chapter 9, verse 29, and I quote the following: "Fight against those to whom the scriptures were given, who believe not in Allah, nor in the last day, who forbid not what Allah and his apostle have forbidden, follow not the true faith, until they pay the tribute out of hand and are humbled." The notion of humbled, dhul, humility, is also further amplified in another verse in Surah or chapter 2, verse 61. Again, let me quote for a moment. "Wretchedness and baseness," says the Quran, "were stamped upon the Jews, and they were visited with the wrath from Allah for their disobedience, their transgressions."
Islam is the official religion in all the Arab countries. According to their scriptures, Islam is the final revelation, superseding Judaism and Christianity, which they believe possess partial and inferior revelations. Jews and Christians are relegated to an inferior status, known as dhimmis.
Dhimmis, legally, are people who are subject or subjected to the rule of Islam. They are supposedly protected by the ruler of Islam, provided they pay some extra tax. But that judicial status also determined their economic, social, and political status. They were some kind of second or third rate kind of citizens. Most of the time, it's a story of persecution and massacres.
The dhimmis must be humiliated because the Quran has, in fact, prescribed that they are to be humiliated and wretched. Humiliation and wretchedness could take an infinite number of forms. In Yemen, it meant in the 17th century, Jews were supposed to clean the latrines of all the cities, wherever they lived. In Morocco, Jews were not to leave the Jewish ghetto, the melach, without wearing two different shoes, a sandal that was rubber and a sandal that was straw. In Iran, in the 20th century, it was decreed that a Jew in the marketplace must sit with his eyes and head beneath the countertop because he must not have any kind of visual eye-to-eye contact with a Muslim believer. A Jew should not go out in the rain because he was a polluter. A Jew in the market may not touch the vegetables because he was a contaminant. So that this 7th century Quranic notion of a humiliated person could be endlessly expanded depending upon the century, depending upon the place, depending upon the time. The idea of a Jew in authority or sovereignty over a Muslim was a theological impossibility.
The hatred and the contempt towards Israel and the Jews is so deep that an Islamic country cannot accept the notion that Jews can have a state, especially as it is a state in a territory which is considered the holy waqf. It's a holy endowment given by God, by Allah, to the Muslim world for all generations to come.
In Islam, waqf, holy or pious endowments, are sacred funds, sacred institutions, and conquered lands whose income is set aside for Islamic charitable causes that are irrevocable. And the concept is very sacred to Muslims. In the year 638 CE, Jerusalem was conquered by Muslim warriors and became a minor province for Islam for several centuries. It is still considered a waqf today.
Much of the world thinks that the Arab-Israeli conflict is a fight over territory. But it is so much more. It is not only a religious war, it is not only a territorial war, and it is not really a nationalistic war. It is a supremely ideological war. It is a war of Islam to return the Jews to their former status of being dhimmis, and to reincorporate all of the territories that the Muslim world considers were taken from them. This truly makes it a clash of civilizations.
אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל. היא מדינת ישראל.
The establishment of a Jewish state in 1948 was a direct affront to Islamic belief, and it had serious consequences for the Jews who were living in Arab lands.
In 1948, there were approximately 850,000 Jews living in the Muslim world. The largest Jewish community was in Morocco, about 250 to 300,000 Jews. There were about 120,000 in Algeria, about 150,000 Jews in Iraq. Smaller communities, but still substantial communities in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and a small 8,000 or so in Lebanon. In 1948, the 850,000 Jews in the Arab world faced a series of very, very difficult challenges.
I personally came to the crisis in the first year of high school. On a Sunday, when I went with friends of mine to a movie theater, they showed some newsreels just before the movie. And in those newsreels, there was a clip about Israel. Israel was a fledgling new country, and they showed the Israeli flag was fluttering there in the wind. And we, the 6 or 7 Jewish kids, started to applaud. And the lights turned on. In the middle of the movie, they stopped the thing. And when the Arabs, it was an all-Arab audience, spotted who was applauding, they started beating us like I never felt in my life. And then, of course, I came home crying, and my father said, "What happened to you?" I said, "So-and-so." He says, "Are you crazy? You live in an Arab country. You know that they are sensitive to the things you shouldn't do." I said, "No. If I cannot express what I feel in this country. I have no place here. I'm going.
In 1948, what happens is that the masses of Muslims from Egypt all the way to Iraq, in their own frustration about their defeats in Palestine, pounce upon the local communities.
There were a lot of massacres, a lot of recriminations against the Jews, as if it were their fault that a Jewish state was born in Palestine. The Arab attitude towards the Jews was that they have to be dhimmis, second-rate citizens. And now they have the chutzpah, if I can use the Jewish term, to even claim that they have the right to establish a state of their own. That's unacceptable in Muslim point of view. And they could not contain their rage.
When the Iraqi army was fighting against Israel, they were convinced that they would eliminate Israel. It was defeated, and they were forced to return to Iraq. Then the Iraqis started to attack the Jews. It happened that they took a wealthy Jew from Basra, and they accused him of selling weapons to Israel. And they hung him next to his house. They arrested many Jews and took them to jail. They arrested many Jews for no reason. I was captured, and they started torturing me. For 3 nights and 4 days, they broke my teeth. I didn't hear out of my ear for several months. I didn't say a thing.
A wave of fear swept through the Muslim world after 1948. And the Jews of each country were compelled to leave empty-handed after 2,000 years of residence that had preceded the advent of Islam by a millennium.
The truth is, the Jews lived in North Africa 5 or 6 centuries before the Arab conquest. They conquered us, not us them. And we were forced to leave our countries, which they occupied.
The plight of the 850,000 Jewish refugees from Arab lands and the losses they sustained have never been addressed by the United Nations or any other world power.
The Jews fled. They didn't come with their documents of property to reflect the enormous assets that thousands or hundreds of years of residence in these countries have accrued to them. We know that the losses financially were in the billions. The breakup of their civilization is also a story that is yet to be properly told.
When I was in Iraq as an emissary for Israel, I thought 40,000 Jews would leave. And behold, a miracle occurred. Jews signed up to leave. In the first 2 months, 63,000 signed up. Slowly but surely, Jews started seeing other Jews leaving, left and right. And they also wanted to leave. In total, about 110,000 Jews left Iraq and came to Israel. Today in Baghdad, there are only 8 people left.
The Jews of Iraq were a community that had lived for over 2,000 years in Iraq. They called themselves B'nai Naharaim, the Babylonian Jews. They went back to 586 BCE from the time of the first destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem.
For the Jews of Morocco, it was a different story. Initially, they were forbidden to leave. In desperation, illegal and secret emigration began with the help of the Zionists.
We're told that in villages in the south of Morocco, in the mountains, in the desert near the Sahara, when they saw Israelis coming to assist them in emigration, they handed over their children to the immigration authorities, and they said that their bags had been packed for 2,000 years, waiting for this moment that had now come. A wave of excitement went through the community of the 80,000 Jews of Yemen when the Israeli planes touched down in Aden. The Yemenites who had been walking barefooted over the desert to get to Aden thought that this was the fulfillment of the biblical prediction that wings of eagles would take them to the promised land. They didn't know from airplanes. This was, for them, a moment of messianic fulfillment.
The most important development following the establishment of the state, apart from winning the war, was the absorption of hundreds of thousands of immigrants into the country. One has to remember that the number of Jewish population on the eve of statehood was 650,000. Within 3 years, this population doubled. You had to supply them with food, housing, work. It was almost impossible.
The basic institutions of the pre-state and the early state were formed in the image of welfare state socialism. And in my view, this was exactly right for what Israel needed in its early years.
The first wave of immigrants came from the DP camps in Europe and the British detention camps in Cyprus. They were followed by the whole Jewish community from Bulgaria and refugees from Turkey, Romania, Hungary, and Poland. They were settled in any available housing in the cities, towns, and villages. The second wave of immigrants were refugees from Middle Eastern Arab countries. Of the 850,000 who left Arab lands, approximately 600,000 settled in Israel. By the end of the decade, the Jewish population had reached an astounding 2.5 million, meaning the population had quadrupled in only 10 years.
The second wave could not be accommodated, and the result was that we had the establishment of absorption camps, and then what we call ma'abarot, namely a place where there was very minimal housing, but people were already supposed to go and find work.
There wasn't enough food. Food went on ration. These people came penniless, homeless, traumatized, most of whom did not speak Hebrew. They had lived as Arabic speakers for 2,000 or 1,500 years. Many thousands with all sorts of medical issues. Israel took in the remnants of the rejects of Europe and the outcasts of the Arab world and made them citizens.
This operation not only cost a lot of money that the government did not have, but also demanded an infrastructure that the country still did not have. And the result was that people stayed in the camps and ma'abarot for long years to live in destitution and in dismal conditions.
My grandparents came to the country and they lived in Ma'abara, in a poor barrack made out of tin. It was like a refrigerator in the winter and like a furnace in the summer. Miserable, but they accepted it. They say, well, we came to the Holy Land, but then everybody was like that. Better to lower the standard of living of all of us than leave persecuted Jews outside because you cannot absorb them.
The emigration of Jews from Muslim lands to Israel was a very anguished process. Not only did they have to leave their homes to which they were so deeply rooted, but they found themselves in an unfamiliar society and administered by fellow Jews, mainly European Ashkenazim, who not only spoke a different language, but had a socialist secular culture that was very different to their traditional religious way of life.
There was a clash between religious and non-religious. The education system that was established in the camps was geared to non-religious programs. However, many of the newcomers, especially those who came from Yemen, were religious Jews, and they would not accept this kind of educations. And as a result, this was one of the cultural clashes that evolved.
What you had in Israel after 1948 were Jews coming from nearly 50 countries. They all spoke different languages, different cultures and ideologies, different traditions, different backgrounds. For the first time in over 2,000 years, Jews had to deal with each other socially, administratively, and politically face to face, all in one country. You know the old saying, 2 Jews, 10 opinions? How about 1 million Jews? Can you only imagine what that can cause?
The challenge for the government was how to accommodate administratively and politically the religious and cultural differences between all the peoples of Israel's varied and complex society.
The Mapai Party, the party of the workers of the land of Israel, which was a non-Marxist socialist party, dominated Israeli politics from 1948 until 1977. There was a very successful, especially in retrospect, a remarkably successful alliance made between the religious and Mapai. Mapai said, you know, we don't care about kashrut. We don't really care about Shabbat. You do. But you don't really care about foreign policy or economic policy. Let's have a division of labor. You guys want religious education? Fine. The state will help support it. You guys want kashrut? We understand. We will pass certain laws that, at least in public institutions, will make sure that the Jewish dietary laws are observed, which meant that the religious always had a voice. And Mapai deferred to them on religious issues, and they deferred to Mapai on economic, foreign policy, and defense issues.
While Ben-Gurion's government built the infrastructure of a modern country, the religious immigrants and the survivors of the yeshivas and the Hasidic courts of pre-war Eastern Europe set out to build a spiritual homeland.
There are many heroes in the story of the rebuilding of Torah in the land of Israel. One of them is the great Rabbi Yosef Kahaneman, the Rov of Ponevezh, who in the early 1940s founded his yeshiva in Bnei Brak. He felt that the future of the people of Israel and the Torah of Israel lay in the land of Israel. And after the war was over, well, then the refugees came and rebuilt Slobodka, Mir. Mir today is the largest Jewish institution of Torah learning in the world. There's 5,000 students. The Hasidic Rebbes came and rebuilt themselves. And then the Sephardim came and rebuilt their lives and produced their great leaders and rabbis. Ben-Gurion could not have imagined the extent to which the Orthodox community would flourish in Israel over the next 50 years. In fact, he was convinced that it would disappear in one generation.
In contrast, most newly arrived immigrants to Israel rapidly adopted a secular lifestyle as a result of the impact of the labor Zionist philosophy and the attraction of Western culture. The world of the Jews was not only changing in Israel, but also in America.
After the Second World War, part of the reward that the American government has in mind for those people who fought and sacrificed and contributed to this great war was through low-cost loans, making it possible to buy and own your own home, not within the city limits, but outside the city in the emerging suburbias of the post-war period. And for American Jews, this is both an opportunity and a tremendous challenge. And although Jews, when they move to suburbia, most of them, are not committed to giving up their Jewish identity, the pressures to become more like all other Americans are greater than ever before. So long as they've lived in the cities, everywhere they turn, they always meet Jews. They may never step into a synagogue, but they feel a strong sense of Jewishness rooted in the neighborhood. Now this is going to change. Now they're coming to a new environment where one of the ethoses of suburbia is that all groups get along. They view Gentiles for the first time as friends, as colleagues, being involved in all sorts of communal activities. They are raising children who see their Gentile classmates not as kids who you're going to fight in the street after school's out, but as people who will be involved with the band, ice skating, what I've called the cult of Little League, being all part of these American activities. And as a result of that, Jewish leaders, religious leaders, have to do much more to offset the process of assimilation, which is magnifying itself during this post-war period. And the other piece of the story is as we move into the late 40s and early 50s, it becomes very unfashionable in America to discriminate against Jews. And although there are pockets of social anti-Semitism, as we move more and more into 1950s, this is an open field. Jews are allowed in like never before. So it becomes a time where anti-Semitism in this country, it becomes less and less of a factor in terms of Jewish acceptance. that it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain your Jewish identity in a country that is more and more accepting of Jews. It's a great challenge. It's really the greatest challenge begins for Jewish identity than ever before.
In 1948, the conservative movement strategically initiated a major departure from tradition. It advocated permitting its congregants to drive to the synagogue on the Sabbath in order to make it more convenient for them to adjust to the realities of American life. With the move to Suburbia, the conservative synagogues, with their more liberal approach to Judaism, became the fastest-growing synagogue movement in America at that time. Reform Judaism, on the other hand, continued to put their main focus on the quest for social justice in American society, and increased its membership by offering a revised Jewish theology that departed from traditional Torah Judaism.
The struggle to create the new Jew continues. On one side, the pull of assimilation. On the other side, how to maintain and balance a meaningful level of religious Jewish life. From a traditional Torah point of view, compromising halacha, Torah law, historically has unfortunately ended up leading Jews astray. That is why the Orthodox, conservative, and Reform worlds do not see eye to eye.
Now at this point, congregations, whether they are Orthodox, or we might call Americanized Orthodox, conservative to a great extent, and Reform, are beginning to build synagogues where Jews can come and congregate, yes, to pray, but also to be among their own kind in a Jewish setting. Then there is this crossover from the experiential and recreational into the spiritual. This is known as the synagogue center movement, what I have called the phenomenon of you come to play and you stay to pray.
After World War II, Jews who came to the United States who were Orthodox came with a level of religious commitment which trumped anything that had been seen in America until that time. They are survivors. They have come because Europe was destroyed, but they bring with them now a sense of cultural superiority, a belief that Jewish culture, tradition, and Torah is transcendent over American culture. And these Jews gave a new vitality to Orthodoxy in America and created the new American Jewish community as we see it today.
One of the major emphases of the transplanted East European rabbinate after the Second World War, led by people like Rabbi Aaron Cutler, who is the founder of the great Yeshiva Gedolah in Lakewood, New Jersey, is the creation of a nationwide system that will promote Jewish education, yeshiva education, known as Torah U'Mesorah. And they're advocates who go out to influence Jewish communities all over the country to move youngsters into Jewish day schools and yeshivot. It is a great struggle, a great challenge, and the commitment that says, I'm going to send my kid not to the public school or the private school, but to the Jewish school, begins at this time.
Torah Masorah created a nucleus of people who wanted an intensive higher Jewish education. And all of the other yeshivot, Yeshivot Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan, YU, Torah Vadas, Chaim Berlin, the Hasidic movements, the new Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was an enormous force, the creation of the Albert Einstein Medical School, which revolutionized the ability of Jews to attend medical school and remain observant. All of this was part of this great growth, an internal growth of belief that Orthodoxy in America not only could take root, but that it would become the mainstream Jewish element in American Jewish life.
In stark contrast to the increasing affluence and security of Jews in America, the experience of the Jews in Russia was dramatically different. When thousands of Russian Jews thronged to the streets to mark the arrival of Golda Meir, the first Israeli ambassador to the Soviet Union, Stalin felt threatened by the surge of pro-Zionist sentiment. He unleashed an anti-Jewish campaign in Russia, including banning all Jewish religious practices on pain of Siberian exile. The last Jewish publication house in Russia was closed in 1948, and Yiddish theater was officially disbanded in 1949. Leading Jewish poets and writers were arrested and sent into hard labor exile or executed.
As part of what became known as the Cold War, Stalin began to crack down on contacts with the West. Along with this came a campaign which was somewhat veiled against Jews, known as the Anti-Cosmopolitan Campaign. There was a surge of Russian patriotism, and anything Western became politically suspect. Who more than the Jews symbolized contact with the West? Every Soviet Jew had a cousin, a brother, an uncle, a friend in places like Chicago or New York or Buenos Aires or Tel Aviv. And those people in the West were asked by their Soviet contacts not to write, because every postcard, every letter meant questioning by the secret police. So they became marginalized as second-class citizens. It meant that they no longer had access to high-level positions, to some institutions of higher education. They couldn't become editors of major journals. They could not rise very high in the ranks of the Soviet army. They were purged from the foreign ministry, where once they had been very prominent. There was a kind of ceiling established beyond which Soviet Jews could not move, and the ceiling became progressively lower.
Let us remind ourselves that just 30 years before, many of the leaders and senior bureaucrats, in fact members of the Politburo in the Russian Revolution and the founding of the communist state, were Jewish. But history has a habit of throwing us a curveball, and Stalin's turning on Israel and on the Jews was no exception.
In August 1952, there was a trial and execution of 20 leading Soviet Jewish figures, many of them writers and leading political figures.
The next manifestation of this anti-Jewish campaign came when an article appeared in Pravda entitled "Murderers in White Coats." Now, Pravda was the single most authoritative newspaper in the Soviet Union. What was the story? It was that these 13 Jewish doctors had tried to, and in some cases succeeded, murder high officials of the Kremlin. These people were arrested. They were going to be tried. Probably they would have been sentenced to death for treason or for anti-Soviet activity.
The reverberations were felt up and down Russian society. Jewish doctors were boycotted and removed from positions of responsibility in medical institutes and hospitals. They lived in fear and under constant suspicion.
Fortunately, Stalin died in March of 1953, and the Soviet leadership which succeeded him rethought some of the things he did. And a month later, in April, the very same newspaper, Pravda, published an article which said, in effect, "We made a mistake." Actually, those doctors were not guilty. There was a collective sigh of relief that one could almost hear throughout the Soviet Union, as Jews realized that Stalin had died and that his plans, whatever they might have been, would not be implemented.
Gathering in the Kremlin, the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party springs a surprise on the world. Joseph Stalin, the man who ruled Russia for a quarter of a century, is publicly criticized for the first time. Khrushchev and his colleagues tell the delegates that for 20 years the party has suffered in all its work from one-man rule. Now they announce collective leadership has been restored and wider party democracy is promised.
Across the Jewish world, the Holocaust and the State of Israel became two new rallying points for Jewish identity. When the state was established, Jewish organizations worldwide raised critical funds for Israel's fledgling economy. In 1951, German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer offered material reparations to the Jewish people and the State of Israel as penance for its crimes against Jews during the war.
We had the debate about the reparations from Germany, which turned into a fierce struggle between opponents and supporters. The opponents claimed that this is letting down the memory of Holocaust victims, and as somebody said, we are ready to accept money as a token for our blood. But the truth is that the reparations money was one of the features that allowed Israel to survive during the 50s from the economic point of view, otherwise the country would go bankrupt.
Israel's infrastructure, including the national water carrier system, the electric grid, highway improvement programs, steel production, the railway system, and other projects were all subsidized in part by German goods and financial help.
It is amazing, not wanting a repeat situation that occurred after the 1914-1918 war, America now poured trillions of dollars into post-1945 Germany. So in effect, the American largesse helped Germany finance the building of Israel by using American money to pay for its reparations. It is not the first time in Jewish history that the Lord has provided different conduits to help save the Jewish people.
The 1950s saw the Cold War intensify between the Soviet Union and the United States and its Western allies, and much of Soviet-Israeli policy was shaped by it.
Soviet policy toward Israel changed radically in 1952. So it was very, very clear that the Soviet Union was disappointed with Israel. It had not become a Marxist state. Yes, Israel had helped remove the British presence from the Middle East. But Israel had not turned into a communist-style state, and it was no longer an ally of the Soviet Union.
In 1953, General Dwight D. Eisenhower became the next American president. After Stalin's death, and especially later, when Nikita Khrushchev came to power in Russia, Eisenhower attempted to create a better climate for Soviet-Western relations, while at the same time strengthening the Western alliance against continuing Soviet expansionism in Europe and the Middle East.
Eisenhower, like many presidents who followed him, found himself in a no-win zone. By courting Arab favor while at the same time supporting Israel, which was the only democracy in the Middle East, Eisenhower created a tightrope upon which all American administrations would have to walk throughout the remainder of the century.
The world was divided at that time between the East and the West according to ideological concepts. The East supported communism, the West supported democracy. And along these lines, every nation had to decide where it stands. Gamal Abdel Nasser, the charismatic leader of Egypt that became the leader of Pan-Arabism all over the world, he became identified with the Eastern Bloc. In no time, he received financing from the Soviet Union, and in 1955, the Egyptians signed a contract for supply of military materials with Czechoslovakia that changed the balance of power in the area.
With that arms deal, the Soviet Union cast its lot with the anti-Israeli Arab governments of the Middle East. The armies of these countries were supplied and trained by the Soviet Union or by one of its allies in Eastern Europe.
Nasser, now supported militarily by Russia, stepped up terrorist attacks into Israel. Against these Arab attacks, Israel conducted military reprisals on the terrorist infrastructure. Nasser, at that time, created and led a bloc of communist, Arab, Muslim, and European nations whose anti-Israel bias was blatant and unashamed. In cooperation with the Soviets, they lobbied the United Nations, who condemned Israel for its actions. It was the beginning of Israel's isolation in the international diplomatic arena.
While early on in the century, Jews sought to create the new Jew, in the second half of the century, much of the world worked hard on creating the new anti-Semitism. This manifested itself in a globally accepted anti-Israel bias. Unbelievably, it was the United Nations General Assembly itself that sought to put Israel's measures to stop terrorism on trial, but never the terrorists themselves.
With Egypt's shift of alliance to the Soviet bloc, Western alliances began to change. Gamal Abdel Nasser was challenged by Britain's close relationship with the two Hashemite kingdoms of Jordan and Iraq. His goal was to unite all the Arab countries under his rule. At that time, Britain's ally, King Abdullah of Jordan, was assassinated for his willingness to make peace with Israel. In North Africa, Nasser supported Algerian nationalist movements in their struggle against French colonialism. In retaliation, France decided to support Israel. France, who had never really been a friend of the Jewish state, now became its main resource for modern weaponry, especially aircraft.
Gamal Abdel Nasser decided to nationalize the Suez Canal and to oust the British from the country.
This enraged both the British and the French, who owned and controlled the Suez Canal. In late October 1956, consolidating his position, Nasser moved a large part of the Egyptian army with its newly acquired Soviet armaments into the Gaza Strip, and was committed, in his own words, to a war of annihilation against Israel. Then Nasser, against international law, closed down the Straits of Tiran to the Red Sea, blocking shipping to both Jordan and Israel. In what became known as the Suez Crisis, Britain and France then allied themselves with Israel in an effort to counter Nasser's aggression. The plan called for Israel to launch a major attack against the Egyptians in the Gaza Strip and the Sinai. The British and the French would then intervene to separate the warring parties and retake control of the Suez Canal. Israel launched its attack on October the 29th.
was a great surprise when Israel joined France and England in an attack on Egypt. The two big powers wanted to reoccupy the area of the Suez Canal in Egypt. And Israel wanted to open the Tiran Straits for Israeli shipping, and also to curb the infiltration and the military actions by the Fedayeen from the Gaza Strip.
At the very time that the British, the Israelis, and the French were militarily engaged with Egypt, the Hungarian Revolution against the Soviet-style regime broke out. The Soviets were very much preoccupied with it. They failed to put down the rising at first in October 1956. But on November 4th, they sent new troops in and suppressed the revolution. Because they were so busy with Hungary, the Soviet Union was not much directly involved in the Middle Eastern events of 1956.
In 6 days, Israeli forces captured most of the Sinai, the Gaza Strip, and Sharm el-Sheikh, the fortress controlling access to the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba. The Israelis counted 172 of their men killed and 817 wounded, while Egyptian casualties numbered in the thousands.
Within days, Egyptian forces were completely routed. The stage was set for the next move in the complex Suez situation. Britain and France, after a short ultimatum, in a joint sea and air invasion, attacked, following a preliminary air bombardment. From a staging area on Cyprus, airborne troops quickly followed and established a beachhead at the entrance to the canal. They were followed by seaborne contingents which swiftly controlled the Mediterranean end of the vital waterway.
It was a military success. However, it incurred the wrath of both the United States and the Soviet Union, who both demanded the withdrawal of English, French, and Israeli forces. Eisenhower bluntly requested a full Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai and the Gaza Strip.
The world can be brought to bear in our quest for a just end to this tormenting problem.
The Russians threatened that their ballistic missiles could reach any point on the globe. Succumbing to the pressure, Israel, France, and England capitulated and agreed to withdraw their forces.
Once again, we see how political and economic expediency changes the course of history. Who would have ever thought that in a mere few years, the British would call on Israel to join with them and France to spearhead an attack on its former Arab ally, Egypt?
The United Nations brokered an agreement that installed peacekeeping troops on the Israeli-Egyptian border. They also deployed forces to guarantee freedom of navigation to Israel and Jordan. By the end of March 1957, Israeli troops were back on Israeli soil. But despite the UN presence, Nasser continued to block all Israeli shipping from using the Suez Canal. The UN also allowed Egypt to regain administrative control over the Gaza Strip. Both Israel and Egypt claimed victory.
Israel won the campaign, hands down, and it was a very important victory because it showed that Israel is still capable of vanquishing the most important Arab army, the Egyptian army. For 10 years following the war, Israel had no attacks from the Gaza Strip and from Egypt. This decade was crucial in building the country, and I would say it was the longest period of peace that Israel ever had.
The 1950s demonstrated a remarkable ascent from the ashes of the Holocaust to the establishment of a Jewish state and the beginning of a religious resurgence throughout the Jewish world. For the Jews from the Arab lands, life was over, and their ancient culture was under assault even in their new homeland. In America, Jews were facing the challenges of affluence, acceptance, and assimilation. In Russia, on the other hand, Jews were trapped behind the Iron Curtain, their religion banned, their status reduced to being second-class citizens. While in Israel itself, a spirit of purpose, courage, tenacity, and growing faith in the divine dominated.
In the first 10 years of its existence, Israel had struggled mightily, battling both with its enemies on the outside and with the Herculean task internally of forming a cohesive, functional society out of its very different nationalities and viewpoints. Having survived 2 wars and continuing Arab aggression, with all its problems, this strength of spirit, intangible but mighty, was perhaps the greatest asset that the small state had in facing its challenging and uncertain future.